keep going. And it was just, nothing you couldn't be proud of. So in terms of that, I think it was very good to our family because I was already kind of prepared for like the things that were coming, even though it is a little different nowadays. And obviously we'll get into that later. Um, but with the kids, I think it really became a priority when I found out that he wanted to be a cop. Like, it's always just something we talk about in our family in such a positive way. And the kids are, very aware of his job and everything he does. We're very transparent. I mean, to an extent, right? We're not going to sit and like
Right.
tell all the things, but like, they are very aware of what he does. I take every opportunity that I can personally to talk about it with them as much as possible. Excuse me. And we tell stories about what daddy does and how he helps everybody out and how any sort of law enforcement, first responder, military is so good for like our community, our country. So I would say in terms of like how we parent, that's probably the biggest way that it influences us is we really make sure to highlight as much as we can all the positives and really make them aware about like what daddy does and the good it does in the world.
Yeah, and I feel like coming from that background for you, since you were a child in a similar environment, you can kind
Mhm.
of navigate some of those difficult conversations because like
Totally.
you kind of understand what they can understand and how
Mhm.
much you can tell them. Do you
Yes.
like, because that's something that I talk about a good amount is like sharing stories and the importance of that. But I
Mhm.
also understand that it can be kind of difficult because they experience things that they don't necessarily want their kids to know about. So how do
Mhm.
you guys kind of navigate the stories that he shares with them? How old are they?
They are, well, one is going to be 7 on Saturday. I cannot even believe it. And one just turned 4 on the 12th. So we have our 2 August babies. So it's been a busy month of birthdays. So yeah, they're still little. But they're definitely at an age where, like you were just pointing out, like my oldest son is obviously, in first grade. And so those conversations are starting to come up just naturally from time to time. Now, granted, ours is a little bit different because our kids are actually, we do like a homeschool hybrid program. So the point is like they actually go to a school that's naturally a little bit more, conservative and faith based and such. So like it's a different dynamic, but at the same time, those questions do come up from time to time, mostly being like in terms of daddy not being able to go to things, I would say is what's
Mhm.
coming up the most right now for like age appropriate circumstances. So we kind of take learning lessons like anytime that we can, we really take advantage of them. Like for example, well, one that just came up recently, so for the first day of school my husband was working, and a lot of kids are used to like both parents being able to show up to the first day of school, like for drop off, they drop them off, they go to their job, and obviously we know with shifts sometimes these guys shifts fall on those days. So we were going to school, and in the car, and even before we had left, like my son was starting to ask, well, why can't daddy take me to school with you? And so I try to really use those opportunities to teach, right? And so I gave him some analogies of like, well, look, like I get it. Like we love daddy, we miss daddy. He wants to be here obviously more than anything else in the world, but if you think about it, like you're going to a school where there's a lot of other children, right? And he's like, yeah, like mommy, I get that. I'm like, okay, so daddy has to go out in the world, and just like you have to be safe when you're at school and taken care of. Remember, that's his job, is to take care of people in the community. So he has to go out there and he has to make sure that all of the other children are taken care of in the world. Like you would feel really bad. What happened if your best friend at school, was hurt or he needed help or anything like that? Like that's what daddy's going out and doing. He's not just being there for you, but he's being there for everybody in the world. So it really gives them an opportunity, number one, to look up to what daddy's doing, right? Number two, it's a learning lesson of like, life isn't always about us, it's for the greater good of other people. And then number three, like, look at what he's doing. He's helping your friends and people, oops, sorry, that are around you. I got a call coming in at the same time. Sorry, Bessie, that was calling. Anyways, it shows them, how they're also helping people that are in your every day-to-day life, and how they really help the world go round. There's no other way to say it.
Yeah. I remember when I was growing up, like we could never participate in take your daughter to work day, like
Hmm.
for obvious reasons. Like my dad
Yeah.
didn't want us in that environment. And it sucked because I mean, I talk about this too. Like, I didn't totally understand what my dad did growing up. Like, I just thought he goes to work and does his thing and that was it.
Yeah,
So I was always like really frustrated that I'd be the only girl in the class on Take Your Daughter to Work Day, which now I think is Take Your Child to Work Day.
yeah.
Um, and so he would sort of make it up to us by taking us in on like a random Saturday or Sunday when like really early in the morning when he kind of had an idea of what was going on, he would know like who or if anyone was in the holding cells. And so he could kind of
Mhm.
control the environment and he could take us in
Totally,
and he could
same.
show us around and things like that. And I was just going to ask, like, do you have any memories that stand out from your childhood that you remember? It doesn't have to be that exactly. I'm just curious if like because innately the upbringing and the experience is different as children.
Mhm.
So, and
Mhm.
holidays, all of the things. We have our own traditions and our own
Yeah.
routines that we make up. Do you have any
Yeah.
memories of any of them?
Absolutely. I mean, there are so many memories where it was just like, my dad did anything he could to just show up in that cop car at the time. Now, granted, here's the thing. It was a little bit different in that times are different nowadays, right? So like
Yeah.
back then, it wasn't as much of a thing as like we lived in the city that he worked in, so that obviously affected things, right? Like he was much more accessible to go to things cuz he was closer. Um but he would always make any effort that he could to like hop in the police car. And if I was like, I played softball my whole life. So he would show up at the softball field in the police car. I'd see him. It would be like, out there playing shortstop, whatever. I'd look over and he'd be there in the seventh inning when it was like the most pivotal time of the game. But he always made such an effort. That was one thing I always remember, to make it to every single sporting event he could, even if it was just like stopping by in the police car, glancing, waving, staying there for an inning, whatever it was. And then same as you, he always took the opportunity when he knew it was that controlled environment, right? To like take you into the office when it was an admin day at the department, like kind of, just let you see the other people that were in the department, the dynamic, and kind of just like give you an idea of what he did, like you said, without like fully going into all the details until we were old enough to understand it.
Yeah, and I remember like when because you mentioned your uncles were also cops, and so
Yeah.
same with me, and then also some of my cousins. So like for us, we talk about holidays and stuff. For us, it was so typical. It was, I mean, every year I have an Italian family, and every year on Christmas Eve we have a big family party, and like
Hmm.
one of the conversations that we would have in preparation for the party was like, who's going to miss it, or
Hmm.
who's going to be showing up in uniform because they're
Yeah.
going to have to like bounce early or whatever it is. So I just feel like there are so many different things that, again, I didn't think about any of these growing up,
Hmm.
and now I reflect on them and I'm like, oh yeah, I guess that isn't typical
Yeah.
because most
But
people
you know what's
don't think
crazy
about that.
about that is that's how important family is. And I feel like that's what a
Mhm.
lot of people miss, is like you have so much influence as a wife and as a
Yeah.
family and how you guys approach it. Cause here's the thing, like you and I, like, yeah, we knew there was some differences, but we really didn't know how different it was. It seemed normal, right? So I think that's what a lot of people miss too, is like, even though you have those differences going on, you have the opportunity to shift it and shape it into anything that you want to be. And your kids, and like how you go back to, saying, how do you raise them? They're going to feed off of you and off of your family and how you approach it and handle it and stuff like that. And that's the beauty, is that you always have the opportunity to, like you said, still create those moments for them and those traditions, and to the point where they're not even going to know that anything's different until they're older, like we are, like you said, and we're going to reflect on it and be like, oh yeah, that was kind of different. I didn't know it at the time, but it kind of was.
Yes, exactly. And that's what I talk about too. Like, it's so important to normalize what happens in your home because
Mhm.
if a child picks up on the fact that what you experience isn't normal, then they're going to feel isolated, or they're going to
Yes.
feel like something's wrong with them and how their family operates, or they're going to question like, why do we do it like this? When at the end of the day, it
Hmm.
doesn't, like, as long as your home is filled with like love, it doesn't matter that
Yeah,
you do things differently.
for
And
sure.
you also mentioned, I think it's also an opportunity because you also mentioned like your dad couldn't make it to everything.
Hmm.
And when I was very young, when I got a little bit older, he had a little bit more of a normalized schedule, but he did have to like obviously take on quite a bit more overtime as a lieutenant. But when I was
Same.
little, he would miss things,
Hmm.
obviously. And I don't have any recollection of him missing things. I'm sure it tore my mom up, but she didn't
Yep.
let us know that we cared or that she
Yes.
cared. And so we didn't think twice about it that he missed a dance recital or a play or like whatever it was, because it was just like, oh, mom takes us to this. And
Yep.
also, again, bringing it back to family as a whole, our aunts would come with us. So her sisters, they were also married to cops. So they kind of
Hmm.
understood what comes with the territory. And so one or both of them would come to our things to kind of fill, not fill the hole, but to be more of a
Yes.
presence in the audience so that
To be
we
the support system.
exactly. So we never
Hmm.
thought twice about the fact that, dad had to work or whatever. And I think it also helped us in the sense that now we're really close with those aunts too. Like we have a
Hmm.
great relationship with them. So it's all just about how you go about it, about how you normalize it, and make sure that they just feel the love
For
that they
sure.
have around them.
For sure. And like for my mom, for example, like the funny part, like with that is when we were growing up, it was only my mom. My mom we didn't have aunts, uncles, everything like that. My mom is from New York and she's, you guys are going to laugh at this. She is one in 25 kids. So we have, yeah, your face. I don't think we've ever talked about that before. Yeah. So
What?
with 25 kids, yeah, I don't know what my grandmother, yeah, don't even get me started on that one. I think she was pregnant like her whole life. But,
Apparently.
yeah, but so anyways, they were all in New York and, they weren't out here. So we didn't have any of the aunts and uncles, but going back to your point of like, even with just her, and I feel like that's when wives like don't really like you have such power over,
Yeah,
like you said, your
that's
day-to-day
it.
life and how things are happening. Like it was all her, like in terms of when my dad couldn't be there. You know what I mean? They were a great team working together. I mean, I literally played club soccer, travel softball. I played softball all the way through college. Like there was never a moment where she was not going from tournament to tournament on the road, like crossing through states at points. I mean, it was crazy when we were growing up. But like you said, it was like she had so much power and control over the situation and how we viewed
Mhm.
our childhood in addition to him, right? It's not like discounting what he did whatsoever. But the point is, like, I feel like as wives, sometimes we kind of forget, like, hey, you've got this and you have so
Mhm.
much more power and influence on your family and your kids. And you are just as important as like them showing up to the job that a lot of people remember.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point too, is like you
Mhm.
have a lot of power and influence and you kind of set the tone. And it can be heavy too, I'm
Yeah,
sure. I'm not a
for
parent,
sure.
but
Absolutely.
there's no doubt that it can be heavy, but it's also it can be flipped to be such a positive because like you
Mhm.
said, like you have the power to ensure that they feel seen and loved and happy, and all of it is complemented by the other efforts that the
Yeah.
law enforcement officer puts in, driving by a soccer game or a baseball game in the last inning just to make sure that they
Hmm.
can see a little bit and not miss
Yep.
out and just show face and whatever they got to do. Like, and I
Yeah.
talked about this recently too. It's like when we were little, my dad worked like an evening shift and he would wake us up for school in the morning
Yep.
before he went to bed for the day.
Yep.
And it's like, that's just, it goes so far. I mean, again,
Hmm.
never thought twice about it. Dad was the one who was waking us up for school this year. And now I reflect back on it and I'm just like, wow, that intentionality went a long way because we got to see him. We have that now as memories. And we talk about it, we joke about it because he was very aggressive how he woke us up in the morning. He would just
Yep.
like turn the lights on. And
You're like, hey, I need to ease into this a little bit, Dad. Hold
yeah,
on.
exactly. I'm like a cat.
Yeah.
Um, and at the same time, it gave my mom an opportunity to sleep in a little bit. So it was
Yeah.
like it supported the whole household. And then, we're all up. My mom is up, we're doing our thing, and he goes to bed.
Yeah.
And I just think that a lot of those little things add up in a big way.
For sure. I mean, there's so much like that I respect, like you're talking about, like my husband and my dad for like, they don't have to get up after a few hours of sleep. And there's so many times where they come home and it's like they, go to bed for 2 or 3 hours and they wake up and like you said, they're there for those little moments. Like they
Mm.
do so much and like, they just have I guess it's like you said, it's all about the intentionality of it, right?
Yeah.
It's like being intentional, being dedicated, really making sure that you're there for those moments still. And like, they do a lot.
Yeah, they definitely do. But I think that it's going to pay off too.
Yes. Oh, for sure.
Long term for sure. But even in the moment, like I'm sure it sucks to not go to bed, after a long shift right away, but you get to
Yeah.
see your kids. I mean,
Yes.
that's worth it in the moment, in my opinion. Do
Yeah,
you
definitely.
obviously there are massive differences in the law enforcement world between when we grew up and now you
Yeah.
raising your kids.
Yeah.
What are some like similarities and differences between how you were raised, if you remember it, and how you're raising your kids now?
Hmm. Well, this will be a fun question.
I thought you'd enjoy this one. I thought you'd be a good
Yes.
one for this.
I mean, okay, similarities wise, like I said, I mean, we really did a big effort to, really reinforce, like you said, the positives, the being there for those moments whenever you can, even if it's really short and simple. The talking about daddy really positive within the family and what he does and his job and everything like that. And we raise our kids especially to follow in the same footsteps. And I guess the easiest way to say that is it's no secret to anybody that like this time is different than that time. It is night and day difference, right? Like there's no denying it. I don't care what people say, there's no denying it. So I think that being aware of that, once again, going back to having such control and power over like how you can create your family dynamic and how they're brought up and what they're learning and stuff is even something as simple as like when we're out and about, I always make sure, even if we see a police officer at a gas station, like we're like, hey, we go up to them, they say hi, they get to get the sticker. I always tell them, yeah, like, husband's law enforcement too. So, like, I am very cognizant and aware, or said that wrong word. I'm very aware of like making sure that the children are aware of like, hey, when there's a police officer, go thank them, tell them thank you, talk to them for a minute. They'd love to give you a sticker just to like always be familiarizing themselves with the job and who they are and like that sort of daily effect that they have on everybody. And it's funny because like I would say 90% of the time too for the guys, I know they're probably like, okay, like this made my day too. Like they like doing that, they like to like break up the day, like, have a kid come up to them, talk a little bit. I mean, who doesn't like that? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
children are a blessing. So it's wonderful to talk to them. Um, so I think that in terms of how I was brought up, I always make sure to do that with them because I always want them to be like, constantly communicating with them, seeing them in a positive light and such. Now, in terms of the differences, um, so I think we're different than some law enforcement families. And this is not, it's to each their own. If anyone, anybody that knows me knows I'm the first to say, like, hey, your choice is your choice and whatever you do, you like, I'm all about like, I don't knock anybody's choices. But for us, I feel like it comes up a lot with some wives because they'll say, like, well, what do you tell your kids? Or like, do you hide stuff from them or whatever? And we don't really do that in our family. I don't knock people who do, and I understand absolutely at the end of the day if it's something about safety or whatever. Like I completely get that, but I think that's something that I always like make sure to be blatantly honest about with the kids. Like I said, to a certain extent, right? Like you're not sitting there telling them all the details of the story, but like we don't really like hide certain things, or like with that with like what daddy does and stuff. And I think it kind of has really given them a sense of security growing up and going back to like you said, like they don't see his job as like different than anybody else. And that was important to me. I didn't want them to see his job as different, especially in today's culture. I mean, let's be realistic. Like, a lot of the times there is backlash from certain people and stuff like that. And so I always wanted them to like never be affected by that because I wanted it to be so normalized for them and in such a positive light that they could just brush it off their shoulder if anything came up, as they get older and be like, well, that wasn't me. So you can think what you want, but like,
Mhm.
that's completely fine. And so I think that's something that has really affected us in terms of being different in raising our children is we are, very open, honest, on our sleeves. The kids will ask questions with what's going on in the world. And I always, like I said, take the opportunity to make it that learning lesson. I'm always very open with them. And I think that, I think children appreciate that nowadays. And I think it builds a sense of security inside them and a sense of like confidence. And, I just, I think especially in today's world, that's important with kids, you know? But like I said, to each their own. I'm not knocking if people want to do it certain ways. And I understand sometimes there's things about safety, but that's just one thing that we've always been open and honest about in our family.
Yeah, and with other people too, like if a classmate were to ask one of your sons
Yeah.
what their dad does for work, they would say that he's a cop.
Yeah. And I know that some people don't, and that's totally
Yeah.
fine. You know, like I said, I mean, let's be like each person's going to have their own unique situation. They're going to have their own unique sense of what they're comfortable with or not, what they're not comfortable with. You know, I think that, I don't know, maybe it was just like I felt like life always dealt so many cards from, like you said, like dad being in law enforcement, uncles being in law enforcement, and then we went from military to police. I mean, I feel like we just have never not known that, you know,
Mhm.
that it's just kind of shaped how we do things.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, to each their own, everyone has to do what works for them and what they're
Yes,
comfortable with. But
for sure.
you made a good point, and I actually a few episodes back, I had Robert Garland on. He's the founder of Fund the First. I'm not sure if you're familiar
Mhm.
with the platform, but I was talking to him about this concept because he has young kids too, and he said something similar. He's like, I get the fear concept, but for me, it's like this is a really good educational opportunity where like
Yes.
if one 7-year-old is saying to my 7-year-old like cops are so mean, cops are bad, or, whatever, then your kid can be the one to be like, well, actually, these are the things that my daddy does or my mommy
Mhm.
does, like helps people, saves animals, like all of these positive things. And who knows how far it will go,
For
but
sure.
it's a good opportunity to plant a seed like that in the other kid's mind. And also it
Mhm.
teaches your kid to look for those opportunities, and like now you do it as a mom, you look for educational opportunities for your kids. And so I think
Mhm.
that a lot of good can come of that. Again, I get the safety, I get the concerns,
For sure, and
especially
that's what I
in
was saying,
this
it's not
day and
knocking anybody
age.
else's choices, you're your own person, you know?
Exactly, and you gotta raise your family however it works. I just think that
Absolutely.
there are a lot of po positives that can come out of being open and honest, and it also teaches kids to, like, stand up for themselves, stand up for what they believe in.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so I think that, like you said, teach their own, but also there's some really positives that can come out of it. And I think, like, well, actually, you are very strong in your beliefs and you stand strong, you stand for what
Yeah.
you believe in, and you're
Mhm.
unapologetic, and I love that about you, and I think it's very inspiring. And I think that, you know, your kids will likely grow up to be similar because you're
Mhm.
teaching them how to stand up for what they believe in at a young age. But
Yeah.
also, I'm curious, is this something you were, like, taught as a kid? Like, how did you come into your own and feel so confident to be
So that is such a
unapologetic?
good question. That is such a good question. Okay, so number one, I will give a lot of credit to, like I said, you know, when in times where A, my dad always taught us to do the right thing, obviously,
Mm,
but B, so did my mom. And there was a lot of times where, like you're talking about, like she just had such a big influence over us and being there. And she always taught us from when we were little, like, hey, right is right and wrong is wrong. And
mm,
there's going to be some people in this world that, you know, you don't necessarily, it's not your place to sit there and judge or whatever. But at the same time, like, you should be the person that's standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. You know what I mean? So, like, you're going to laugh, but like, I was always the kid on the playground that, like, I would stand up to those bullies, and it wasn't even about myself. Like, if I saw someone being mean to, like, not even a kid that was my friend, I would be like marching my little self right over there. Like, that was just always me from when I was little. So I think in a way it's kind of been how I've always been. But at the same time, that changed. And not a lot of people know this about me. So when my husband first became a police officer, like when he was in the academy and stuff like that. So gosh, we're going to go on kind of a rabbit hole here. So like I said,
mhm,
I had always grown up playing sports my whole life. Like I'm very close with my family. I always had teammates around all the way through college. You know, I never was like had the opportunity to be alone, right? So we all know that when you come into this life, now granted, it kind of prepped me a little bit because we went through a deployment when my husband and I were dating. So like, you know, but even that, like that was kind of my first experience with that and it was tough, you know. And then so we came from that and it being hard. He came back super happy, but pretty much pretty soon after he came back, I think it was only like 6 months later or something like that, he went right into the police academy. So it was a good time span of like a few years where it was like I really had to cope with how to be alone because I had never done that my whole life. I had always had people around and teammates and roommates and whatever. And I'll be completely honest, like I was not good at it at first. Like I was like, man, this is like hard and like, it's only me and this and that and the other. And then I kind of had to take a step back and be like, look, like I have one or two options. And I feel like this comes up a lot of times with wives. And once again, it's not a knock on wives that feel like this, because first of all, it's completely normal to feel like that. And I think that people sometimes think like, oh, is it just me that feels like that? No, I feel like if people are being honest with themselves, everybody goes through that season at some point when you're a police wife, unless you're like the unicorn, which I guess like there's a unicorn in everything, right? But the point is like, even just being human beings, like it's natural to feel that way sometimes, especially if you're a person like I am the extroverts of extroverts. I am the most social butterfly you're ever going to find in your life. Like my husband is even always like, Tiffany, you never stop talking on like anything. So like the point is I wasn't used to that. I wasn't used to, being lonely and being alone and like whatever. But I realized that I had a choice. I was like, look, I can sit here and I can be bitter and just focus on the fact that, oh, I'm alone, what am I going to do? Or I can realize, hey, like this is my opportunity to grow individually as a person, because I feel like we miss those opportunities sometimes, and I feel like people don't realize that I'm a woman of faith. So first of all, sorry to people if you don't like, that's my thing. Might not be your thing, but that's okay. Um, but I was like, you know what? Like God's giving me this for a reason. And I feel like a lot of the times people miss that. Like, and that's just my faith and what I believe. But I believe that God gives things in your life to the people, sounds cliche, but that are able to handle it. And if you're not able to handle it right then, in my opinion, you can take steps and better yourself and grow individually to, like, God knows that you're meant for that role. So I feel like I remember sitting there thinking one day, like, okay, I have two options. I can either sit here and be like this, and I was struggling and I had a hard time with it, or I can choose to be like, all right, what am I going to do to start growing and be different? It's a choice that you have to make. And sometimes you have to make yourself conscientiously make that choice. It's not just going to come naturally. Sometimes you have to put in the work, just like they're showing up to the job, going through the academy, putting in their work. Like you got to put in your work too. Like they're changing as a person and learning things. And that's your opportunity to also do that to yourself, even if it might look different than what they're doing. So for me, it was learning that independence. And so my first thing was I was like, okay, for the people that are social out there, and if you're going through that, find a community. Find a community. Like there's always people around you, even if it's not your family and your friends. Like for me, I was blessed to be close with my family, but still like we don't have a big family. So even if it's
Well,
just
your
putting
mom
in like,
does.
yeah, she does on the other side of the country for sure. I mean, I don't even know all my cousins on the other side of the country, but I don't even know that I show up every time and I'm like, who's this? Well, yeah, do that. Like, it's like it's a thing. But anyways, it's like, I really took that opportunity for myself to get involved in church. Church was a big one for me. And I feel like
Mhm.
people miss that so much of the time, because even if it's something where you're not quite there in your faith yet, the thing is you're giving yourself a community and tools to learn how to
Mm.
cope with that, sometimes when it comes up being lonely, right? So for me, I started diving way more into that eventually. Like I was always faithful, but I never had actually went to church religiously growing up because I was always playing softball on Sundays. I mean, that's what it was. But I took that opportunity to start to look into a community, and it really helped me a lot. Like even just showing up to church on Sundays and maybe picking a weekly activity to go do, it helped me being around other people because I felt like it was number one, letting me fill my cup with that, socialness, because that's how I am. And number two, I was like, man, like I can do this by myself and be by myself. And that's totally fine. Like I can grow independently as a person. And then I went into a totally different route. But even like fitness was a big one for me. Like you've got to give yourself things to focus on in those moments. Give yourself goals, go after a dream, get involved in church. Like there's so many ways that you can force yourself to grow, because at the end of the day, the reality is this obstacle is coming up for a reason. And I started to think about things like, not, I mean, we weren't at a point where we were having kids, but I did think about that. I was like, man, if I can't deal with this on my own right now and cope with it, how am I going to teach my kids how to do that when those moments come up in the future? You know what I mean? And so I feel like it's really important for women to realize that, like, you have to do that sometimes as a wife. Like, you have to make yourself grow. You can't keep sitting in the same spot, or else it's going to be like that for the rest of your life. Like, challenge yourself, go find those things, and the beauty is that you will find you will grow independently. And then you get to this point, like flash forwarding to where I am now, and I'm like, I mean, sorry babe, I love you, but it's like, see you later, like, like see you when I see you. And I think that it really was such a growing tool for me, and I think that if I didn't push myself to go out of my comfort zone, and that, I don't think I would have been as comfortable with this lifestyle. And there's a lot of people that struggle with this lifestyle because of that, because they're not forcing themselves to grow individually to be more independent. Oh, that was a whole spiel.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I absolutely love being alone, so I can't relate,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I think
My
you made
best
a
friend's
lot.
exactly like that, who actually dates our his best friend at the department. So that's kind of funny.
That's really funny though, because you're so extroverted, and if she loves
Yeah.
being alone, that's really funny. I
Yeah.
like
Well,
cannot
I was just saying
resonate.
more, she's more of a balance, but for sure, she's ready to, like, she's the person that loves getting in bed at the end of the night and like popping open her book. Like, that's her. That's
Yes.
not, but
Yes. And like if my husband were to want to go on a trip for a few days, see you later.
yeah,
I'll see
yeah,
you when I see you. Like,
yeah,
give me my space.
for
Um,
sure.
so I can't relate, but I think you made a lot of really awesome points. And I hopefully, someone who's listening can take something away from that, because it's so it's just so important, because you can't forget, as much as it can suck, you also have to remember, like, I am also a person. I am an
Hmm.
individual, and I have to do what I have to do to make the most of this situation. So
Yeah.
I think that
I
is
mean, if you
awesome.
aren't growing, what are you doing? Like, we should all be willing to grow. And, like, and I think that's something people miss. And I think even with, like, kind of going on that concept, like with the attitude of today, I feel like a lot of women get affected like that too, with how you brought up, well, we kind of brought up, how that's something that's different, is obviously backlash towards law
Mhm.
enforcement families sometimes, and attitudes and things like that. And I think that that also gave me that kind of, you know, confidence. I mean, like you've talked about, I'm very open about what I believe in, and I'm very, I stand strong in my values and stuff like that. But it's because that growing process gave me that confidence. And especially going back to leaning on God. I mean, even last night, like we were talking about, gosh, oh my goodness, it was the best line. I like sat there and it was funny. I thought about it. I was like, oh, I need to talk about that tomorrow. That's such a good line. Like, he was saying, don't talk to God about your mountains, talk to your mountains about God. And I was like, that is such a good line, because it's something that we miss so often. Like, you need to approach your problems and the backlash and things like that, in my opinion, at least, with a backbone in this faith of, like, I don't care if you get mad about this. I don't care if you don't
Mhm.
approve, like, of my values and my family and stuff like that. Like, I don't answer to you. I answer to someone that's a lot higher than you. So I feel like women and wives get so caught up in, like, there's always going to be someone that doesn't like this lifestyle or has the backlash or whatever. Don't give them that satisfaction. Fight for what you believe in. Know that that person at the end of the day is not going to be the person that matters in eternal life. Sorry, they're just not. And, it's, have that confidence, handle yourself with that confidence. Because once again, you're not watching yourself, you have little ones that are watching you too. And so you can't give into that negativity. You can't give into that backlash. You fight like, you know what? I'm not going to cuss on here because I don't know if we're allowed to,
You
but
can.
like, you fight like, you know what, at the end of the day. But at the same time, you don't let it affect you to your core, because you have to have confidence and strength in who you are, because that's what you're going to be teaching your kids. And that's the identity that you're developing in front of them. Right.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. Do you
Hmm.
have you this is kind of like a side tangent, but have you given any thought to how you would handle it if your sons decided they wanted to get into law enforcement?
For sure. I would support them 150%. And I know
Yeah.
that nowadays people are like, you are nuts. But the thing is, I kind of view that as, you know what they're going to be getting into, right? Like I said, you always just have to be realistic about your situation. But I think also I would view that as such a positive that they watched their dad growing up and took such positive things from that, that they want to go do that same thing. Like I'm sure a lot of people, even like parents, think about that with their kids that want to go into the military. Like it's scary, you know what I
Mhm.
mean? For sure. But at the end of the day, that's so amazing that you inspired them so much to want to do so much good in the world that that's what they want to do with their life. And I think that you just can't always you can't live in that fear. It'll eat you up. It'll eat you up.
Yeah.
It'll overwhelm you. And I think that, yeah, if my kids came up and told me that, I would be super happy and proud of them. I would know they would have a tough road in front of them. So I'd be their support system, but I would be, just ecstatic that obviously they watched their father and they idolized him that much. I would know that we did our job as parents at the end of the day to give them such a positive relationship and view that that's something they chose to want to do with their future, you know?
Yeah. Does your husband feel the same way?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I would say yeah. Like, I mean, that's kind of hard, right? Because they also know what goes on at work. They
Yeah,
know
exactly. Because
that
he's
side
like
of it for sure.
firsthand. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that that's a tough one. I think he would. I think he would be a little, nervous, especially with nowadays, like how it's viewed. But I think
Mhm.
he would be super proud of the fact that that's the same thing, like that they want to go out and they want to take on that job. And, I mean, the reality is at the end of the day, the hardest things you're going to do in your life are the things that are going to have the most impact on the world. And like I know that sounds super cliche, but it is what it is. And I think that it's also why it's so important now, going back to the politics aspect of it, that you really need to like fight and stand up for what you believe in super loud and proud right now, because you want that future to be better for them. Like if your kids, A, for kids in general, just their future, but B, like if they decide to go into law enforcement, like that's why so many families, I feel like, are it's pretty cool right now to see so many families coming together in law enforcement and stuff and being more comfortable and getting their footing and getting their confidence, because it's not just about us, it's about them. And like if they decide
Mhm.
to want to go down that path, heck yeah, we want it to look different than what it is right now for
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. I
So
think that's a
yeah.
really important point. And I also
Hmm.
think like as parents, you can both support what your kids want to do and also wish it wasn't that. Like
Yes.
growing up, my dad never wanted us to become police. Like it was a hard
Yeah.
no. But at
Yeah.
the same time, like if for whatever reason any of us did decide, none of us did, but if we did decide we wanted to be cops, like he was going to support that route
For
and
sure.
do whatever he could to set us up for success and safety. But his
For sure.
preference was he wasn't watching, his little ones put on a
Yep.
uniform every day. Did
Yep.
any of your siblings become cops?
They did not, but the funny thing is that even when my parents found out my husband was going to be a cop, like they had that conversation with me, both like my dad and my mom. Like they kind of, A, I already kind of knew it right from growing up, like you had an idea, but also B, they kind of prepped me and went into more of like, okay, so, but this is what that's going to look like. And, there's going to be days like this and days like this. And when you have kids, there's going to be days like this and days like this. But that goes back to the whole point of, I think, why I'm so open and honest with my kids is because I feel like that honesty with them throughout our whole life has always prepped me for what's coming. You know what I mean? And that's been why I've been able to cope with things, develop, grow, be stronger. Like they were always very open and honest with me about that. And when they had that conversation with me, I really appreciated it because I felt like it prepared me for the hardships that were going to come from time to time.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was a minute where my husband was thinking about going into law enforcement and my
Mhm.
parents were very supportive, like, "Yes, do it, just do not do it in a major city. Like, we will not
Yeah.
support
I was
that
going to say it
in any
also depends
way."
on where you are.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the thing too growing up because all of my family was Philly PD, so it
Yeah.
was like the concerns stemmed from the safety element. It wasn't any of like
Yes.
the hardships that also comes with law enforcement because that's like a whole nother topic. For
Yeah.
us, it was like the safety piece because if we were to become cops, it likely would have been Philly PD because that's what we knew, that's
Yes.
where we were. And that was like a hard no.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that brings up a really good point. I mean, it all does really depend on where you are too. But even like look at yourself. I think that's even a strong point to make that even being in a bigger city, like you still grew up with that positive childhood. And like, I think it's important for people. I think sometimes when people hear, you know, us talk about these things, it's like, oh, they aren't where I am. And it's like, no, you're over there in that city. My husband, I'm not going to specifically say his city, but I'm going to tell you right now, if you guys saw my husband's city, it's the, mayhem of all mayhem. It is not the easy city whatsoever. He's all in the specialized everything. And it's never short of being interesting, to say the least. So the point is, like, even that, like being in those difficult cities, right, in the
Mhm.
bigger city areas, and the dynamic and the crime and stuff that comes along with that, you are still able to once again have control and shift what your life is in those moments.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So thank you for kind of emphasizing that. Um, I want to be mindful of time. I do have just a
Yeah.
couple questions that I want to specifically ask you.
All right. Shoot.
Um, One is how do you and your husband intentionally connect with one another as partners?
Okay. So, first of all, like it's such an important question because I feel like people, you can make intentional time so little and subtle. And I feel like people kind of like
Yes.
forget that. Like, even me at the beginning, like I viewed being young and like, especially when we didn't have kids or whatever, I thought it had to be like this big date night all the time was intentional time.
Mhm.
And then you learn that life is life and you don't always have time for that, especially when you have kids, right? It's like you barely get time to be by yourself, let alone to like be
Right,
with be with them.
right.
So I think we shifted that. We always do make it a point to where if it ends up being a crazy week where like he's gone a couple weeks for training or it's a lot of overtime, this and that and the other, we are fortunate enough to have my parents close that we do intentionally set aside a time to just even like go grab a bite to eat together really quick. Doesn't have to be this big old thing. But a lot of the times for us, what intentional time looks like is like literally watching TV together on the couch. Like enjoy your TV show, get your glass of wine, pop up with your blanket and take the opportunity to don't talk too much in the show because he always gets mad when I do that. Like he's like, you cannot talk through the TV. Get your questions out now. Like can't do that. So learn from that, everybody listening. But at the same time, like just that in itself can be intentional time, like watching a show together that you guys like, and like, taking the opportunity to cuddle for people that like that stuff. Some people do not like, and that's totally fine. But I think for us, like, that's what intentional time looks like a lot. And then even like taking the kids with you out to lunch, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like people nowadays get really pressured to like, I think they think they can't do it with kids. And it's like, no, you totally can. Cause you know what? In those moments, I'll be totally honest. Like if we go out to lunch and after they visit with us and stuff like that, I don't care if my kids want to play on the iPad for 20 minutes so that I can have a conversation with him. And I feel like people sometimes forget that you can have so much connection and intimacy in those like 20 minutes of just having a conversation. Hey, how'd your day go? How was your week? What did you do? Joke about stuff. You know what I mean? So I think that intentional time is important and it's a lot easier than people think. You just need to shift your mindset of what intentional time actually looks like.
Yeah, and don't overcomplicate it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And difficult seasons as a wife and mom and as an
Hmm.
individual obviously happen a lot, I'm sure, and
Hmm.
navigating all of the things. How or what are some ways that you have worked through? You don't have to get into the difficult season, but what are some
Yeah.
ways that you've kind of shown up for yourself during difficult seasons?
Okay. So, number one, I mean, we already touched on the one. A big one for me was church. Like, I
Yeah.
lean on God very heavily in my life and community and stuff. So, that was a big one because, like I said, loneliness and independence was hard for me at first. And I feel like that's a very common thing in this lifestyle. Is there's a lot of women that, like, that you don't realize, like, you can't, they're not going to text you back when they're on shift. Like, and they shouldn't. And I think that's something that, like, actually people miss too is how I got through hard seasons like that was you have to put yourself in their shoes and understand the job a little bit more, and sometimes it's difficult for people to do that. They take things personally and it's like, oh, like you're not texting me back, this not the other. No, they shouldn't be texting you back because it's not safe for them to be on their phone if they're in especially a city that's very active and stuff like that. So number one, you got to learn not to take things personally. It's not personal, it's about safety, and at the end of the day, Do you want your husband to be texting you 24/7 and something, God forbid, happen? Or do you want him to be safe and be paying attention to the job? So you have to be realistic about things, and you have to realize that, not everything is so personal. So that was one thing for me, is I had to view it in a very non-personal way for the stuff when it would happen. And then, like I said, God was a big one. And then honestly, I feel like I also shifted my mindset a little bit, and like focusing, for those of you that have kids, motherhood is hard for sure. 150%. But number one, it really helps to, like I said, even just get an hour to yourself. Like if you need to wake up in the morning an hour earlier before your kids, do it. Like have your you time. If it's that you need that 1 hour workout in the day, do it. Like you need to establish a you time, and that's really important. I feel like a lot of people feel guilty about that, and you can't feel guilty, because if you're not taking that little bit of you time, if you can't do it and your husband's working a lot, like in our family, then you're not going to be productive and showing up for your kids if you're not, being productive for yourself and filling your cup that way. So get rid of the self-guilt, do that hour you need to do in any way that it looks like, whether it's quiet time, working out, whatever. Set aside an hour for yourself in the day where, like I said, don't care if they're on the iPads. And then also, there was another point I was going to hit on with that. I think that, and it sounds very silly, but your mind is the most powerful thing, and your mind shift is the most powerful thing, right? And I think that a lot of how I started viewing things was like, yeah, I'm alone a lot in these times, and I have all these things I'm balancing with my kids, but at the same time, like, appreciate time and how fast it goes by, and be present in the moment. Because even just taking this for example, which I feel like moms can relate to more, like with this part, is your kids are not going to be little that long. I mean, you blink and, like, I remember my son being a baby, and now he's about to turn 7 on Saturday, and really, like, take that time that you have alone with them, and like you said, make it intentional and appreciate that time and enjoy that time and embrace the chaos, like, because you're only going to go through this once, and you're going to look back and be like, oh my gosh, I miss those days so much.
Mm.
And view it as something that is something that a lot of women don't get. Like there's not a lot of moms that have that opportunity to stay at home with their kids, and in this life, I mean, I know there's a lot of moms that work too, but there's not, I feel like it's more common in this field to
Mhm.
also have a mom that stays at home because you're having to balance that crazy schedule, right? But for those moms specifically, like, value that. There's not a lot of moms that get to do that with your kids and really appreciate and soak up that time. And it's such a blessing to be able to be home with them and soak up that little time and kind of just shifting your mind. There's always a way to shift your mind from the negative, because the devil's always trying to work and make you focus on the negative, to how can I shift this in a more positive light? Your mind's a
Mhm.
very powerful thing, and we forget that.
Yes, and I love the point that you made about texting at work, and I think, like, maybe I'm a little bit old-fashioned, but I'm like, why would you text your spouse at work anyway? Like, I
Yeah.
just growing up, we didn't have texting, so I'm like, why?
Yes.
And
It's like the
now,
instant gratification thing.
yeah, and even now,
Yeah.
like, I mean, my husband's a substance abuse counselor and he's with patients all day, so I
Yeah.
don't text him while he's at work. So I just think, like, and if he had a job where his life was potentially on the line, I certainly wouldn't be texting him, or like
Yeah.
at least expecting a reply. I think
Yes.
that's just like such, and I don't know, maybe it's an
No,
unpopular
no, that brings
opinion,
up a
but
really good
like,
point. That brings up a super good point, because, like, even with what I said, I mean, don't get me wrong, like I said, I'm an extrovert. So if I feel like I can't talk to someone, like, I will send him a paragraph just updating him on my day. But the thing is, I don't expect a response back. I don't take it personally. Like, hey, if that's how you need to get it out, it's like, okay, I told you about my day. Okay, I'm good. I'm gonna go about my own day. Like that's fine, but don't expect the response back, because it's not safe.
yes, exactly. And it's like,
Yeah.
I don't know. He's at work. Let him
For
work.
sure. No, exactly. You nailed it right on. You nailed it. Yep. Yeah.
Okay, and then my last question for you is stories about his job. So when he comes home from work and he wants to share with you maybe what happened at work, does he, like, is that something you are open to receiving? And did you guys, like, have any
Talk
sort
about
of
the boundaries.
conversations about what you were open to listening to and having in your world versus like what you couldn't necessarily handle talking about?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And that is so important to have
Mhm.
that conversation, and you need to be honest with yourself. And I feel like that's something that people miss a lot. Like, if you're not someone that can handle that, do not do it. Like, do
Don't
not do it.
pretend
If
you
you're someone
are.
that is anxious, like, just, you need to be honest with yourself. You know what I mean? And so, like, if you need to tell him, like, hey, I can't be that person. Like, I want to be here for you, but, like, I think, like, if they have a best friend or something like that,
Mhm.
somebody else, like, if you can't handle it, they're not going to benefit from you not being able to decompress it. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Like, it's
Yeah.
going to stress them out more than anything. And so you need to have that conversation. You need to be honest with yourself. I mean, there are some people that they go to the, I mean, I don't do this, but I know there's stories about, like, people that sit and listen to the scanners or what. I mean, first of all, I don't even know where people get that. Do you know where people get that? I mean, that's not a
I
knock
c
on anyone that does. If you're watching, that's fine. But I'm just saying you have, like, immense amount of investigated skills, because, like, I don't know where that is.
no.
But I think that brings up a good point too. It's like, you got to live your daily day-to-day life. Like, you have to do it with your life. You know what I mean? You cannot, like, uh, yeah. Anyways, getting off topic, but
That could be a whole
yes,
nother rabbit hole. We don't have
yes.
time for all of
No,
that.
no, no, no. Having that conversation is so important. And we did have that conversation. And like I said, I think that me knowing that, like, I am the person that could handle that and decompress that. Like, I wanted to be the person that he came to, but I also knew I could handle that. If that's not something you can
Mhm.
handle, don't do it, because it's not productive. Like, at the end of the day, just being blunt and realistic, like, don't do it. And if you can, great. It's great for them to be able to come home and talk to you. So, like, for me, like, yes, we have very open conversations. I mean, obviously there's some stuff they're not going to be able to tell you, which, by the way, don't get offended or mad at that either. They cannot tell you some things. They're not allowed to tell you, like, and they shouldn't, like, for, like, if it ends up being a conflict of interest, whatever. Because I have heard stories too about people that are like, why don't, like, I wanted them to, sometimes they just can't. And that's that. Like, you gotta, like I said, don't take things personal. Um, but we are, for the things that we can talk about, we are super open about it, and we talk about everything. And, that's just become a normalized part of our life. But it also doesn't like, I worry in terms of being a partner, right? And you're always going to naturally worry about your partner, but I don't let it doesn't worry me like that. And that's why I can do it. Like I said, I'm very faithful, and I believe in faith over fear. And, like, that's just something I've been always able to handle and decompress really well. And so that's just my personality.
Yeah, and I think you actually made a good point. Like, there's two elements at play with this topic. It's like, can you handle it emotionally? Like, are stories
Hmm.
about children or older
Yeah.
people, or are certain stories going to keep you up at night, give you your own version of PTSD,
Yes.
whatever it is? But also, is hearing about what he or she is involved in on any given day going to bring you unnecessary fear? Because,
Yes.
like, again, it's twofold. It's the emotional mental health aspect, but then it's also like, you don't need to be afraid, and constantly
Hmm.
being connected, like constantly listening to the scanner or constantly watching the news or constantly hearing about, his most chaotic moments can perpetuate fear. And if it does, then you're not the person to listen to some of those
For
things, because
sure. For sure.
sometimes it's like, the more you know is not as good. It's like the less you know can work in your favor sometimes.
Yes, yes. And that's something where I think there's a difference between being educated and being fearful. You know what I mean? And,
Mhm.
like, that's why, obviously, anyone that knows me, has been to the page whatsoever, like, knows that I am very open and honest about things, and I talk about things very publicly. And so I think that there's being informed, and then there is being fearful. And I think there's a very fine line that you walk between the two. Um, and I think that at the end of the day, like, and I tell this to a lot of police, but, like, you have to trust your husband, and you have to trust his training. Like, if you're always sitting there thinking about the worst possible thing that's going to happen, I'm going to be blunt. Your life is going to suck. There's no other way
Mhm.
to say it. Like, like, I'm trying to be, cognizant and, like, not too blunt, but at the same time, it is what it is. Like, you have to trust their training. Yes, you know that this job is dangerous, but it goes into, like I said, being aware, being educated, but also at the same time being able to trust their job and their training. And you know what? If you want to help them, then you do your part and you do things to change what's going on. And that's where I think it, inspires me so much to speak out on things that I do, because that's my way of helping. That's my way of changing. You want to change and make their, you know, job better, this dynamic better, our country better. Great. Do your part and go out there and speak out. But you can't not trust their training at the end of the day, because it's not going to benefit anybody. You know, you got to do what you can do, and you can control, and you control your voice. That's where you can help out, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And living in a state of fear as the spouse is going to hurt